Stakeholder.
In gambling, an independent party with whom each of those who make a wager deposits the money or counters wager.
A person with an interest or concern in something, especially a business.
In emergency management, any person or entity with a vested interest in the survival and recovery of a given community. You.
Welcome to Stakeholder Prepping.
Welcome back to Stakeholder Prepping, where you are the stakeholder in your own survival. We're your hosts. My name is Chris.
And I'm AC. And Chris, this episode is partially by listener request, but partially just from some recent events, but critically important for a large chunk of our audience, including myself. And this kind of peril, this is the one that keeps me up at night.
I have no doubt, because today we are talking about wildfires, and it's not just fire bad, run away. Today we're actually going to be talking about wildfires from the perspective of government response, evacuation, planning, mitigation, the works. We're going to try to give a rundown on this.
Right. And before we do that, one more plug to a couple episodes back to our Joe Flowers episode. I wanted to remind everybody we have some Joe Flowers signature cards, and anybody that has some Q&A for us or for Joe, we are going to give away a Grimm Workshop signature Joe Flowers card to the top three, best three questions. But we'll probably read most of them in the episode and try to answer them and get Joe to answer them too. So if you haven't submitted a question yet, do that. I think maybe next episode we're going to do that.
I think we should have enough questions lined up by next episode. So yeah, let's do it for next week.
Cool.
You still have time to get it in.
Yep. Dig it.
All right, let's go ahead and jump straight into this episode let's do the natural angle first.
Okay.
So wildfires are actually necessary for the growth and sustainment of forests, grasslands, wildlife, even waterways. And it seems a little counterintuitive. Why would fire be good for waterways? And we'll get into that in just a minute. But fires are a natural and necessary part of life for the planet itself. It's our human interaction with them that really causes that pain point and that strife.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. So I don't know if you knew, but pine trees, I was today years old when I learned that there's a difference between pine trees or pine cones and fir cones. Did you know fir trees have cones, but they're called fir cones? They're not pine cones.
Because they're furry?
Because they're fur. I didn't know that. I bet you've always called a fir cone a pine cone, though. It's like, I don't know, man. It's like a Q-tip or something. They've lost the fir cones have lost their brand identity. But but pine cones, they actually need fire to melt the sap off the seeds. That's what we call pine tar. And if I'm going to throw you some 1990s baseball trivia, but if you remember John Kruk with the Phillies, he always had his helmet covered in gross pine tar and stuff. But that's what they have. Remember that?
Yep. So he could touch it and get the grippy sticky on his hands.
Get the grippy sticky on his bat. And I think actually Chris Farley played him on an episode of Saturday Night Live because he was so gross with all his pine tar. But we get on the baseball bats and stuff. But anyway, the pine tar that falls off kind of the outside of that cone casing, and it lets the pine cones open up and actually lets the seeds fall out and take root on the ground. And the more stripped the ground is of competition, meaning that the fire has burnt away all that ground cover, then the more viable those seeds are going to be to grow. So fire is what actually clears that ground cover away. It melts the pine tar. It lets the seeds open up. It provides fertilizer with the remaining, the ash, and it clears away the larger trees to allow sunlight down on the ground for growth. So the trees have actually adapted. This is kind of like the circle of life where, although wildfire is dangerous, it's actually a pretty necessary part of the healthy ecosystem in the forest.
I would say that's 100% on target. The forest can't grow unless there's something to grow into, and clearing the way for that growth is what the fire does. Where it gets dangerous, at least for humans, is where we interact with the forests along what are called urban wildland interfaces, or
Sure.
UWIs,
Hmm.
for short, UWI, UWI. Depending on your part of the world, it may be called WUI or WUB for wildland urban barrier, or even just the sticks if you're out there.
I
in
live in the sticks. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
right.
the sticks. So these are areas where housing developments, farms, commercial real estate, building projects, kind of all of the above start to encroach on those untamed areas. And this is where we get bear and cougar sightings, coyote attacks, and the like. These are all really areas where humans and wildlife live in close proximity to each other, so they're far more likely to encounter each other. But when you add in just a little bit of fire into the mix, it creates this devastating blend of trees, shrubs, bushes, grass, structure fires, and it makes it significantly more dangerous for our daily lives because those structure fires can spread like mad.
Right, yeah. Oh, dude, when you add in structure fire into the forest fire, you get like this fuel that burns significantly hotter and longer than I guess just the surrounding forest. Because like a house fire, that burns at I don't know 1100 or 1200 degrees Fahrenheit, while like a forest fire might top out around 800 degrees, depending on the wood and the sap content and all that kind of stuff. But that difference creates a much faster spreading fire, and the radiant heat from a structure can cause they're called radiant bursts, where the fuels surrounding the flames can just spontaneously combust due to the heat given by a structure. So you can actually feel the difference, like on your kitchen stove, right? Turn the stove on low and see how much heat you're giving off, and then turn the stove on high and see how much further away you can stand from the stove and feel that. That's kind of like how it works. So it's just not the same level of heat, not to mention like the toxins that come from structure fires, and man-made objects burning versus just like the wood material in the forest. You've got insulation and plastics. You've got cars full of gasoline. So when you start to throw those other man-made objects out there in a forest fire, it's a completely different ball game.
And that really is why fires along that UWI or the UWI, they are so uncontrollable and so disastrous. It takes far more water and manpower to put out a structure fire rather than just dousing an area in fire retardant or water buckets or whatever you have. Structure fires burn hotter. They oftentimes, the core of that fire cannot be accessed by overhead water because it has a roof. I mean, we created roofs
Sure.
and ceilings to keep the water
Yep.
out,
Yep.
so we're making it more difficult to put that fire out. We have that difficulty there. But beyond that, you have to take firefighter safety into account. And really, as we've seen with the Palisades fire and even the Camp Fire back in 2018 or so, these fires can move with high winds up to 1,500 feet a minute. And that's 5 football fields in a minute. That's more than 17 miles an hour if you calculate out the math. So even if you can sprint a quarter mile in under a minute, you're still not outrunning that thing on foot.
It's absolutely, it's crazy to think about that. Yeah, just the speed at which a forest fire can move, because we always think about like oh man, you could just like outrun it, right? Like there's no way a fire can outrun you, but it absolutely can when you've got good prevailing winds. Absolutely, the fire can outrun you. So like let's take a look at like the government response to all this, how local agencies can mitigate or handle some of these events. I know the Palisades fire has gained a lot of attention recently, right? But we can look back at like that Waldo Canyon fire in Colorado, the Camp Fire in California, these fires that just spread across Texas a couple years ago. And close to home for me personally, in 2017, we had the Eagle Creek wildfire in the Columbia River Gorge. Literally, 15-year-old kid throws a firecracker down in the gorge. Boom, fire just gets absolutely out of control. And I saw the story about that kid. He was 15 years old, and he got, I think they leveled like a $36 million civil penalty against this 15-year-old.
I don't
like
doubt it.
like you just have to wait till you're 18 to file bankruptcy. Like, what are you
Pretty
gonna
much.
what are you gonna do? It's just crazy. And then in 2020, I want to say in early September, we had a fire that produced damage of like monumental, catastrophic proportions. The fire that started, it basically started three separate fires. They called it the Beachy Creek, the Lion's Head, and then the P515 fire. These were ignited by lightning in August of 2020, and then the three fires gradually grew in size before explosively spreading in early September during this giant heat wave we had, and fanned by, these east winds that we get. Then soon enough, these three fires, they all merged and became one big giant. So like fire Voltron, and they just merge, and then this fire destroys 1,500 structures in the Santiam Canyon, which included just massive destruction. The city of Detroit, where there's a really cool lake there to recreate on. That town just gone. So that became one of the most destructive wildfires in the history of Oregon. And obviously, we have no shortage of data on these kinds of events.
Yeah, and we are talking about Detroit, Oregon, not
That's right.
Detroit,
Sorry,
Michigan,
not
right?
Detroit, Michigan. Detroit, Michigan is always on fire, I think, because of the tire fire. But no, this was.
I was gonna say, we
Yeah,
need to
Detroit's just
clarify
always
there.
on. Yeah, Detroit is basically always on fire. No, Detroit, Oregon, tiny little, just a lake town in the Santiam Gorge there. Beautiful, beautiful area of the state, beautiful area of the country. But that town is essentially gone. Those fires came together and just destroyed Detroit, and it's on Detroit Lake. Yeah, it's a beautiful area, but the fire just destroyed that entire area.
And it's what you said is absolutely far too true. There is way more data on these types of events that we're just starting to put together and kind of
Right.
collate. So let's take this from a different angle. Firstly, planning for fires along any UWI is a critical part of localized emergency planning, right? So you should be able to go to your local emergency management office or even your county public records site and get a copy of their mitigation, preparation, and response plan. Those are a matter of public record. So if you know the commissioner or go sit in on a city council meeting, you should be able to get a copy of this. You can adjust your household plan based on how that document looks, because it's going to give you an idea of what resources are immediately available, will be made available, and what the measures of last resort will be. That's kind of hey, this has spread too fast, too far. We are pulling everybody back so we can make another defensive line. That gives you an idea of what your timelines could be. So let's kind of jump into the planning and mitigation side of this.
Yeah, and that you bring up a really valid point that all of the plans for a disaster, these are all available if you know where to look. Like your emergency management office, and sometimes just the county, these preparation plans actually exist. And I think far too many people, maybe people just don't know where to find it. Or I think a lot of people in the preparedness community are so untrusting of government that they just don't want to look into it. They don't believe what the government's going to tell them, right? But when we're talking
Get off
about
my lawn.
get off my lawn, boy. But when we're talking about disaster management, I think that these plans are put in place by people, not big, giant, faceless government, and then they are enacted. They're mitigated. These plans are taken by people in your community. So I kind of do trust what those people have to say. I've got a kind of a personal story about that I sit on one of the boards for my port commission. And quite often I see like on local Facebook pages where somebody will be like, hey, I saw by the airport they're clearing out a bunch of land. Somebody told me it was for a FEMA camp or some shit like that. And it's like, no, man, you could actually go to the meeting where we talked about it. We're actually just going to like park bulldozers there because we're building the airport or something. Like people just don't think about that, right? They don't, you know what I mean?
Yeah, and they don't put in the time or the effort to do a little bit of fact checking or research on it. It's, well, I heard it from this guy at this place, and he heard it from so and so
Right.
down the street, and that makes it gospel. No,
Right.
It really doesn't.
And you know
You
what?
got to do a little bit of research.
All of these commissions and people that put these plans in place, they're actually all public meetings, believe it or not. Like in your area, at whatever it is, whoever owns the land that you are concerned with, whichever public entity owns that land, they have meetings and they actually talk about what they're going to do with that land. And we've talked about this at about government before because they're very slow to get started. It's a slow roll, but they do take a lot of planning. You can go sit in on these meetings. Every one of these areas where they have big giant swaths of land that the government owns, there's like a 10 and or 15-year plan already in place for that land. So if you want to know what the government's going to do, like it's already on paper somewhere. And I do this locally just because I'm on a board, but all these board meetings we have are actually open to the public. So if you want to know what's being planned in your area, that's actually all public information, right?
That is also how you can influence what's going to happen in
That's
your area.
that's
'Cause
exactly right.
nobody on that council, nobody on that board knows what you're thinking or
Yep.
knows how they should look at things differently unless you speak up. So definitely get
That's
involved in
right.
your community in the planning.
Yeah, and I can tell you in my little county advisory commission that I sit on, like I bet every other meeting, maybe there's one person outside of the commission that shows up. Like it's like the public doesn't attend, but when the public does attend, we're like, oh my gosh, there's like somebody here. Do you want to like say stuff? Because like nobody generally gives a shit. So it is kind of cool. It's yes, you can get involved, and it is very very easy. And the squeaky wheel usually does get the grease, and I can tell you that, from experience. But
You're going to
so
have county commissioners coming up to you. Can I get your autograph? We've never
100
actually had a person
we
sit in on one of these.
We've never had a person show up, and about half of the people that show up are crazy people, right? But half of them are just concerned citizens or concerned landowners that if they have an idea they bring to the table, we'll actually act on that stuff. So I think most municipalities will. But okay, so let's get back on topic. We know what stops the fire, right? It's mostly water. Water is what stops the fire. So why don't local emergency management offices just sort of douse entire swaths of their UI lines in water? Well, because it's a very valuable resource, believe it or not, and it's in demand from other areas such as like drinking water, cattle grazing, things like that, fish populations, you name it. Everybody wants their water and wants their water rights. So the CDC and ready.gov advise that you should have like a gallon of water per person per day. And that's kind of everything. That's your water loadout, right? From drinking to sanitation to washing your dishes. Every single person should have 1 gallon per day. And, they suggest this on their website to have in case of like an earthquake or a blizzard or a tornado or a lot of other disasters like, the forest fire. But imagine a gallon a day for you. In order to stop a wildfire, it can take a gallon per square foot to prevent a blaze from spreading. So simply put, there just isn't enough readily accessible water to stop most fires, once they really get going.
There really is not. And you'd think, salt water, like off the coast of California,
Sure.
you can just go out and fill all your buckets with salt water. Well, it can severely degrade equipment significantly faster than fresh water. It's a piece of critical equipment. So if that helicopter or that plane goes down because it was not designed to work with salt water, it takes it even longer to get replaced or repaired. And that means more time for the fire to be able to spread unchecked.
Sure.
Some equipment, like super scooper planes, are designed specifically for saltwater, but the majority of equipment is really not. Your pump trucks, those are going to burn out the pumps if you throw salt water in them. But that can mean traveling significantly significantly further to get refilled. And that's whether
Right.
it's a pump truck, Bambi buckets on helicopters, even getting water to the firefighters on the front lines so that they can drink,
Right, yeah, and isn't that why a lot of ranchers and fire departments, like, they have special, like, water tanks and holding ponds and things like that, kinda like that. They've got, like, their little, shortstop water point, basically, for helicopters and for the fire engines to stop. A lot of these ranchers will have just big, giant, man-made ponds out there that they use as their little rally point, right?
Yeah, and you start to see those more and more often for people that live in UWIs, like ranchers, cattle farmers, even just people who live up in the mountains without easily accessible roads. They'll
Mm-hmm.
keep large raised ponds on their property to assist with firefighting operations. Most of the time, they're kind of your 4 foot high above ground pool, 15 or 20 feet across. The owner just tries to keep it filled, so if a helicopter comes by with a Bambi bucket to fill, they don't have to travel all the way back to the depot to get it done. Most of the time, these are going to be like bright orange or bright red, so the owners do everything they can to keep animals, especially their cattle, out of it. I mean, they are called Bambi buckets for a reason, and that's why. But think of it as like an above ground pool that's specifically marked with, hey, come get your water here so you
Yep.
can put out the fire and my house doesn't burn.
Yep. Yep. Okay. So that's how local landowners can assist. But I guess what about actual government planning?
So I'm going to do my best here. This is where things kind of veer off into conspiracy theory land a little bit.
Oh, I
So I'm
can't
going to
wait.
try to stay out of that as much as possible. There are reservoirs in high fire danger areas which the government, whether local, state, tribal, municipality, federal, they're supposed to keep those filled for that exact purpose. In several historical cases, however, including the most recent Palisades fire, these reservoirs were either empty, not full, single use only. They were not being refilled after the buckets came by and filled up. And obviously, without the water there, helicopters and pump trucks have to travel further to refill, meaning they're off of that line for longer. They're spending more time trying to accomplish the same job. And unfortunately, these reservoirs are oftentimes neglected, not maintained, left empty for maintenance. And if it happens to be during one of those times of crisis, they're pretty much useless puddles.
Right. So what we seed the clouds with barium, and it turns the frogs gay, and then it puts the fires out. Is that where you're going? That's kind of my Alex Jones.
I, I recognized it. I think you need more whiskey and cigarettes in your
Yeah,
diet to really nail that gruffness, but
that's right.
it was good.
Okay, but all right. So I think I'm following you here. I believe I saw something about like a 1.3 million gallon reservoir or something like that that was right near the Palisades fire, but it had been offline for months due to maintenance, and this was actually scheduled maintenance. So the departments couldn't use it. Right, this was a pre-planned maintenance event, and so it was drained a few months ago, but it hasn't been refilled yet, right? And then even at that, when you have high wind areas, well, now all your aircraft are out of commission for that blaze anyway, and that's what's happened in a lot of these big ones that get out of control. Is you just have crazy winds, and then your helicopters and your aircraft can't fly anyway. But it just kind of sounds like this is the perfect storm of events, right?
To put it bluntly, yes. There were several tanks and reservoirs that went down for maintenance kind of in sequence, which really is a necessary part of proper planning and mitigation. But they all came down without any of them going back online. So it left this really huge shortage of supplies to battle these fires.
Right. So, like, yeah, that's like having to put out a fire in your backyard and having not even a major fire, right? And then realizing that you forgot to pay your water bill, or your water was just shut off for some reason. So I mean, that's kind of
Exactly.
terrifying. It's terrifying to think about that. And I do want to point out here, regardless of like politics or jurisdiction, it is a ton easier to kind of point out failures of government rather than the successes. When we Monday morning quarterback these things, firefighters, they really do their absolute best with the resources that they do or don't have, and they do their best to protect when and where they can. And any failures that you can point out, they're not really the frontline firefighters the vast majority of the time, but rather it's the leadership and the bureaucracy. And it's kind of like we talked about, where it just government is slow to get things done. It's big government stuff. It's not those people on the front line. It's big government slow roll stuff.
That's a very, very valid point, and that's a big part of understanding government response. You're right. The guys and gals on the front line, the ones with the Halligans and the scrapers and the shovels, they are not at fault for these fires, unless you point out the one time in 2002, the Hayman fire that was started by a forest ranger trying to burn letters from her ex-husband. But the vast majority of the time, yeah,
Right.
they're out there risking their lives and doing their best, and we don't give them enough credit
Right.
because it's easy to point out those failures.
Right, yeah. And I think, I know a lot of firefighters, close personal friends. I think they all are pyromaniacs. So, yeah, there's probably some bad apples in there, but that's not what we're talking about. These big ones are they're caused for all kinds of different reasons, but so wildfires they can start out anywhere. The campfires getting out of control, the cigarette tossed out of the window, lightning strikes, rims of wheels hitting the concrete and sparking from a flat tire, things like that. The heat from a catalytic converter lighting grass on fire, even the family's dog's leash tipping over a barbecue grill from chasing a squirrel, something like that. And trailer safety chains. This is one thing that I always keep track of because I'm towing a trailer sometimes, and safety chains dragging on the ground. They can spark, and then obviously we've got arson. So there's no way to predict exactly what will set off one of these massive fires, right?
That's true, but we can plan and mitigate against the
Mhm.
circumstances when fire dangers are high. So you'll see on the news red flag warnings. Those occur when conditions are kind of dry and could result in a fire. Black flag warnings are where conditions are prime for fire development. And there's actually a scientific method that goes into it where they measure uh, the water levels inside of individual pieces of wood and materials.
Oh,
They'll actually
yeah.
measure the internal humidity.
Oh, wow.
But we can watch the weather. We can actually think about our actions before doing something that could get out of control quickly. But beyond that, there are plenty of other steps that we can take to individually combat wildfires.
So you're talking about like the Firewise guidelines, right?
Yeah, exactly. Great program. And AC, since you brought it up, go ahead and fill everyone in on it.
Sure. Okay. Well, so I know a little bit about this, but so this Firewise program, it's an initiative by NFPA, which is the National Fire Protection Association, and this is like basically to prevent structure fires and devastation after a major wildfire. So, what is NFPA? It's a nonprofit organization that develops and publishes standards for like fire, electrical, and even like building safety. I've worked with NFPA a little bit in the development of the thermal imaging cameras that firefighters use. So there's like an NFPA standard for these cameras that firefighters use when they're going to fight fires inside burning buildings. So the NFPA's goal is to reduce injuries, deaths, economic losses caused by fire and related to hazards. So in short, it's a series of guidelines and measures that homeowners can take to protect their communities from fire. So the NFPA has kind of published their own standards for the homeowner, and they're all pretty good ideas. So things like clearing brush and scrub from around structures, and they say like out to 5 feet, and that's kind of the primary ignition zone. Not having trees or bushes within 5 feet can help prevent a home from catching fire if obviously the bushes around it catch fire. Beyond that, they say like out to 30 feet from the house, spacing trees at least 18 feet apart from one another. So if one catches fire, then the rest of them don't go. And then they say out to 100 feet away from the house, trees spaced 6 feet apart from each other. And that gives like a denser feel to the surrounding areas, but it also prevents significant undergrowth from building up to an unmanageable level. So installing things like mesh screening under the eaves can prevent sparks from getting into the home and catching insulation on fire. Even cleaning out your gutters of dry leaves, repairing shingles to stop sparks from hitting the plywood of like roof decking, things like that. putting a screen around external propane tanks is a big one. Um, these are all things that can be done to stop a fire from taking over your neighborhood. And the NFPA, they'll actually certify that a neighborhood is Firewise compliant, which a lot of insurance companies will actually offer like a premium discount. So if your whole community is NFPA Firewise certified, then you may actually get cheaper insurance. And the flip side of that is, if you aren't, sometimes insurance companies just won't cover you because you're too far from a fire station and you're not NFPA compliant, and so you're just too big of a risk sometimes.
And that brings up another really good point. So we won't go too heavy into insurance. We want to do a complete insurance episode so that you can kind of understand your policy
Yeah, I think we
better.
should do that. I think we should do like an insurance as a prep episode, because I think a lot of people just they don't read their policy. So we should table that and talk about that in a different episode.
Yeah, we'll do that for sure. But don't let your insurance policy be your only safety net if you live in
Right.
a fire danger
Right.
area. Take steps to follow the Firewise guidelines, even if the rest of your community isn't. I mean, put in the effort to clear the brush, rake under the trees, get rid of all the potential fire dangers in close proximity to your home. And your efforts may be the difference between not being able to return home after a fire evacuation and not. Like
Right.
that, those small efforts can go a very long way in being able to go back home.
Mm-hmm.
And like you mentioned, with the NFPA standards, there are a ton of other measures you can take. So obviously, if you're in an apartment or a condo or have an evil HOA like me that wants to prioritize the color of the window coverings in my fucking garage over safety, yeah, got to work through it. So,
That's a great story, and I totally want to talk about that sometime because it's an awesome story.
oh man, I tell you, HOAs never
Uh,
again,
they're
never
evil.
ever
Yep.
again.
Yep.
But there are a lot of things that you can do
Mm-hmm.
to kind of prepare yourself. So the first thing is really make your property into a safe zone. So one of the first steps in wildfire home protection is creating a safe zone or a buffer zone around your property.
Right.
And you kind of create this safe zone by minimizing. If you're not fully eliminating all of the fuel around that can lead to wildfires, trees, landscaping, wood piles, anything else that's flammable and can act as kindling once that fire gets started,
Mm-hmm.
just push it back if you can't get rid of it. Create that safe zone. Native vegetation. If you are in a dry area, that's going to be things like cordgrass, a lot of hedges and bush rows, like roses and thorns and things like that. That's going to be more dense and harder to burn. And this could be, you want to get rid of any of the dead or dying trees and shrubbery, keep all of your trees and shrubs pruned, um, you know, more than 6 inches off the ground for your pruning. Any shrubs under trees should stay under 18 inches high, because if the shrub catches fire, you don't want it leaping up
Oh yeah.
into the tree.
Yep.
But beyond that, flammable liquids, they should be stored in an appropriate container and place. If you do run your house on propane or natural gas and you've got that big tank, put a screen around it so that ash and flaming debris can't just blow across the valve and wipe it out. Um, you want to avoid having things like wood piles right up next to your home. Keep them a safe distance away. It's 5 feet. Odds are you are taller than that distance, so you can just lay on the ground and pick up a log from your front door without ever having to put your slippers on. But you want to make sure that, things like wood pile, wood fence, you don't want them directly connected to your home. For heavily wooded areas, you want to make that kind of stretch, not to 5 feet, but maybe 50 feet. Where less wooded areas, they can get to that 30 feet safe zone. But California residents, actually, a lot of areas require 100-foot perimeter for a safe zone. And if you've got anything in there that can catch fire, your insurance may cancel you, or aren't getting that Firewise discount.
Yeah, that's actually that's a good point, and I think I like what you said where you're just like, yeah, you make your property a safe zone because that's scalable, right? That's not just talking about people that have all this big giant, have a bunch of land, but even if your wall touches your neighbor's wall, you can still make a safe zone. When you put your Christmas tree up, don't put it in front of your space heater. And if you've got common communal furnaces or heaters or something, you can be the smart person that keeps combustibles away from it. So just always be thinking in terms of making something a safe zone is just a good idea.
And that comes down to if you have a wood burning fireplace and you're going to have a fire, yeah, it makes sense to bring logs in so they can kind of start to dry. You don't have to go back outside. Don't put them
Hmm.
right in front of the fucking fireplace.
Right, right. And there's so that we've got a bunch of ideas here, but obviously having a water source close, whether that's a cistern like a pool is a pretty good is a pretty good way to mitigate against fire because you've got a bunch of water right there, or a cistern, or even in some places just having a rain barrel, right? If you've got a rain barrel attached to your gutter that fills up with the 30 or 50 gallons of water that you can use for gardening and things like that. But then when you need it, I mean, God forbid, let's say your water is turned off or you're on a well and the electricity goes out during a fire and you've got no water to fight. So, just little things like that, having that you've got somewhere that you've got water stored. Like if you have a pool, for example, firefighters can use like a pump to pump water out of your pool. If I do not have a pool. If I had a pool, the first thing I would invest in would be like a big garbage pump, trash pump, sump pump with a real fire hose and nozzle on the end. These are very inexpensive, a little Honda pump that pumps, however many gallons a minute, and you could just have your own little makeshift firefighting setup because you already have all this water. So if you've got a communal pool or some, communal water source, maybe it's a pond close, man, you just need a little trash pump and a nozzle, and you can fight fires in your neighborhood.
Yeah, you don't need it to shove out 1,500 gallons a
No.
minute.
Mm-mm.
It doesn't take that much.
Right.
Another thing that you can do, and this is oftentimes looked over because it is kind of expensive, but one of your home's best defenses against fire is the roof. And sparks
100%.
and burning debris and all of that can be lifted and carried by the wind, a half mile away, and you think you're safe, but it lands on your roof. And because of that, if you are looking at getting a new roof, go with an option that's more fire resistant than your traditional roofing options. Asphalt shingles, wood shakes, wood shingles, things like that. Those are just going to light up like a tinderbox. So
Right.
go ahead and spend a little bit more. And it's at that point, it's not going to break the bank to switch from wood shingles to a fire resistant material.
Yeah.
It might actually even save you
If
money.
you're already yeah, if you're already getting a new roof, you're right. That also comes down to to the way those things are insured too, the way your insurance company treats that. Because again, if you're switching to a material that is more fire resistant in a prone to fire area, you got to look at all angles. This thing it may actually save you some money. So, um, things like taking care of your gutters, even right, like
Oh, yeah.
that,
Super
that's
easy.
that's just a huge one that I think people overlook a lot. But if you have fire resistant materials on your roof, but your gutters are just full of super dry leaves and they're just sitting there under your eaves, that's a huge problem. So basic home maintenance stuff, that's huge.
And there's more that you can do if you are in one of those heavy wooies.
Hmm.
If there is a wildfire, another key to your home protection is actually your windows. So replacing things like single pane windows with dual or multi pane windows with tempered glass, the stuff that you see in car windows, super
Yeah.
hard, but when it breaks, it doesn't cut the crap out of you. Um, you could also have like plastic clad or fiberglass window screens installed that are going to prevent stuff from getting inside such as a large piece of debris or a tree branch. Those features are going to help reduce the radiant exposure to your house, and the glass itself is probably going to be more energy efficient, so you're going to save on your AC anyways. But that's going to help keeping those fire embers from getting into the house. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a good one. And along those lines, not just the windows, but I think all your building materials, obviously, like you're not going to go reside your house with, um, concrete board or something. But let's say you want to build a new deck or a gazebo or something. It's not a lot more money to do that out of like Trex material or these synthetic materials that are fire resistant. So when you're thinking about those kinds of things, when you're thinking about, maybe you are gonna build a new deck, just using fireproof materials, especially if you live in an area that is prone to fires. The more fireproof you can make your home, the less likely you are, to suffer any kind of severe property loss.
And that's very true. I know another thing you can do, and this is not something that most people think of. It's not something that I would suggest going out with a sawzall and doing. But keep your siding, if you are going to look at using non-combustible siding for your
Hmm.
house, keep it like 6 inches off the ground and have a barrier in between, specifically for pine beetles, because that's what makes all of those pine trees just explode in fires. They get eaten out by pine beetles, which come up the tree trunk from the ground. They'll do the same thing to your siding and just turn it into a matchbox. But if you keep it up off the ground, and again, if you're using fireproof or fire retardant materials, you don't have to worry as much about this.
Sure.
But just don't use wood siding down towards the ground. You're going to get termites, you're going to get holes, you're going to get leaks, and it becomes fuel for the fire.
Well, and even easier than that too, like just trenching out. I had my landscaper tell me not too long ago I'd put a bunch of like bark down all around, and he was like, "Hey, all you got to do is just scoop out that um all of that bark dust, so you have about a 6-inch gap under the lowest piece of siding, because again, that's not just to get, not just for the bugs and all that kind of stuff, but or the rot, but also the fire, because if you get that smoldering in things like wood chips and bark dust and things like that, having it next to your siding versus 6 inches away from your siding, that really can make all the difference. So those kinds of things are easy too.
Same thing with wood fences. If you have, like we do, we've got a dog fence. It's a 6 foot high privacy fence, and ours is wood, but
Hmm.
we have it sealed so that it's fire resistant, more fire resistant than
Sure.
just untreated wood. But if you've got an untreated wood or a vinyl fence, that especially if it butts up right against the house, it doesn't take much to have a fire race all around every corner of your fence, and all of a sudden it's against your wall. So think of your fencing materials. If you are going to replace your fence, what's going to be something that's more fire resistant so that you can avoid losing the house?
Yeah, that's a good one. And the other one I think about a lot is like the vents and eaves. So I think people don't think about that, but like the just the ridge vents in your house or the eaves under like your soffits, those vents, having a skinnier metal mesh versus like a bigger opening again can make all the difference, because like you talked about, you've got these embers where they could be airborne and flying through the air, and having just tighter mesh on these vents that expose the inside of your house to the outside of your house, those, just having a smaller mesh can be the difference in those embers finding their way into your attic when they're airborne and not. So that's super easy. I mean, that's $10 worth of materials at Home Depot that you can go out and get some of this little mesh metal, like bird blocking type stuff, and making sure that the holes into your house that exist for airflow cannot let fire into your house. I know that sounds like really simple and really stupid, but walk around your neighborhood and look and see. You're going to find a lot of, eaves and ridge vents and things like that that are open enough to allow sparks in.
Sparks, animals, which
Yeah.
can do a lot more damage as well, but
Yep.
those animals can also start shoving stuff out of your attic that
Sure.
becomes fire fuel. So block them from getting to
Yep.
it.
Yep.
And
Yeah, that's a good one.
it's just that it's the light duty, like 1/8 inch mesh screen cover
Yeah.
stuff that you're talking
Super
about,
cheap,
right?
super cheap, super easy. That little metal mesh. And yeah, that can be the difference between fire getting into your house and not getting into your house. I know it's so simple, but it's so true.
And last major one that I want to bring up is uh, it's all about plants. So
Mm-hmm.
if you are going to have plants in your yard, if you're not going to xeriscape it and just wipe it all out,
Mm-hmm.
doing things like having an irrigated green belt with the right plants and foliage,
Good idea.
30 feet around your house, keep it watered regularly. And it can be difficult in places like California, but using a soaker hose or a drip irrigation system, even collected shower water, those are all options to help maintain vegetation. Regardless of the method, keeping that area irrigated can help to slow down a fire, but it helps more if you are using the right plants and foliage. And it sounds like, this is kind of a dumb thing. It's not going to make that big of a difference, but the right plants can act as a barrier and slow fires down as long as they're regularly watered. So these are going to be local plants that are fire resistant, drought resistant, and you should probably get with a landscaping expert to do some research on this, or a horticulturist in your area. Go to the nursery and talk to that guy who's just sitting on his phone anyways.
All he
He
wants to
has
do
a
is talk to you about plants. He's just waiting
absolutely.
for you to come ask. That's all he wants.
He just wants to talk to somebody, but you won't let him. It's cold outside. Let him in
Yep.
too. So there's a lot of things that you can
Mhm.
do to help really protect your home against fire, right?
Yeah, and like you said, slowing it down, that could be the big thing. When you're talking about a catastrophic, total loss, major fire, just slowing it down, that really, it sounds crazy, but that really could be life and death. There was a video recently I saw a family, it was like evacuation from a fire area, and they caught the very start of the fire coming up a ridge, like a mile or so from their home. And they were trying to evacuate and get out before the fire got there. And it only took 34 minutes to get from that ridge to their doorstep. So, you have to understand that you really don't have a lot of time to get out. And this dude was trying to spray down his roof with the water hose while the wife was packing the suitcases, loading up the car, getting your documents, all the things we've talked about before. If you've got to bug out all the things you need to have, all the things you probably already should have in your bug out bag. But this really is the only kind of last minute mitigation you can take. You put a sprinkler on the roof and you hope for the best. So we can talk about home construction a bit, I guess, like, asphalt shingles, at least the newer ones, are built to withstand fire for about an hour. They have, like, I think it's a class A fire resistant rating, but eventually with enough heat and exposure, everything is going to burn. And all you can do is make sure you're ready to go and slow the fire down when it gets there.
And don't get me wrong, I understand delegation of duties during a time of crisis, but don't be that guy who's trying to water the roof while more important things require
Right.
attention.
Right.
It's too late at that point. I
Yeah.
mean, you need to get the fuck out, not waste more time and deplete any remaining water pressure for the fire department to do their job. That's why having a plan in place ahead of time is so unbelievably important.
Yeah, and I think that brings up, like, the next point. What to do if you are under the threat of wildfire? And I certainly am. This is something that's near and dear to me because, yeah, that's kind of the one thing. Maybe that and earthquakes, but really, wildfire is really the one thing that keeps me up at night. And there's just so much that can go wrong in cases like these. So, you know, you need to really be your own stakeholder here. Like, first, having an escape plan for evacuations. A lot of jurisdictions will use like a multi-stage evacuation notice. So going from, like you talked about, the red flag to the black flag to the then pre-evac notice, or voluntary evacuations, and then into these mandatory evacuations. And then they become escorted evacuations, right? If the police are knocking on your door during a wildfire saying, hey, they're here to escort you for your safety, then you've probably waited too long. So,
Yeah, you definitely said get off my lawn too many
you
times.
definitely said get off my lawn a few times. Yep, that's right. No, and I'm telling you, man, I am one of those people that I really do want to like mitigate and do everything I can to kind of fight the fire, and ideally, fight the fire at my neighbor's house rather than fighting the fire at my house. But, if it's time to go, you've got to have that go bag. You've got to have it at the ready with the essentials for you, the essentials for your family, and better yet, you've got it in your car if you live in one of these areas, right? So, keep the tank of gas half full. We always talk about that, right? Keep half full or better, so you have the range to get away. Keep the extra water bottles in the car, things like that, just in case you don't have time to fill up that fancy limited edition Stanley mug of yours.
I could not agree more here. So pay attention to the weather forecast, the warnings, the evacuation notices. As soon as they come up, you should consider repackaging all your essentials, because the more time you have to prepare, the more time you're going to have to evacuate, and the less
Yep.
traffic you have to deal with and get stuck in when all of your neighbors decide to leave because they weren't paying attention. You're already gone. You don't have to worry about that traffic jam. Um, you know, do things like get a copy of your insurance policy, the deed to the house, driver's license, critical documents. Keep a copy of them on a thumb drive in your pocket, and that way, it's attached to your keys. You always have it. Anything that's truly irreplaceable, if you are in one of these super high danger areas, consider relocating it to something like a safe deposit box. I cannot stress this enough. The home and everything in it can be replaced. You cannot. So the
That's right.
Xbox, the clothes, the shoes, the mattress, your favorite toothbrush, all of that material stuff can be replaced, but you still have to be around to file the claim, right?
Yeah.
So I do want to talk a little bit about how your risk matrix, we talked about that in
Sure.
episode 6,
Yeah.
how your risk matrix is going to play into fires, because they can easily close roads and egress paths. So you need to know where your secondary and tertiary egress paths are. And having your maps, like you can get from MyTopo,
Yep.
having those maps, knowing where to go if a street is blocked off, doing this and having the knowledge before you need it really is imperative.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's knowing this stuff now, like in your neighborhood, to think about, okay, if there's a fire and something is blocked off, you know, knowing immediately how to get out and without referencing the map, hopefully, right? And a lot of that comes down to just having the map already and being able to look at it on your wall like I am and saying, okay, I know if this road's blocked off, I know where to go and those kinds of things. But yeah, you're right. If you do wait too long, then you're going to need to know that secondary and tertiary egress point from your neighborhood, because fires have a funny way of just closing roads down. So that's one thing. That's one thing you really do need to be conscious of is being, when you do have to go, knowing how to get out of there.
And we talked about the PACE model,
Yeah.
the primary, alternate, contingency, and emergency. That applies not only to communications, that's also your ingress and egress routes. How
Sure.
are you getting out? What happens if this road is closed? What happens if there's a car accident at this
Yeah.
intersection? Things like that. What happens if the smoke is so thick that you can't see? Will turning your fog lights on help or hurt?
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good
How?
point.
So there's a lot of factors that go into this, and that's why your own risk mitigation tables should be more comprehensive than a lot of people give credit for. Make it a family activity, do a couple of dry runs and drills, and make it fun for the kids if you've got them. Challenge yourself to be better. And that's where understanding how all of these different little pieces, one small thing can make a big difference later on down the road. So
Yeah.
that's the whole idea behind prepping to me.
Yeah, and we didn't even talk about in forest fire communications because you know that's something that can definitely go out is if you lose power in the area and those cell towers stop working, then your cell phone will stop working. So having those alternate communication methods, if you've got a group of people or even just the neighbors, and you guys have a common uh, common channel that you use, whether it's FRS, GMRS, ham, whatever, being able to think about that beforehand and saying, hey, if we've got to go and if the cell phones don't work, here's how we're going to get a hold of each other. Have that plan in place now. And we talked about that. I think this, go back, listen to the risk matrix episode and have your own risk matrix. If you are in a high fire danger area, then make sure that you already have that contingency plan and that risk matrix for a fire scenario, just like every other scenario, just like your blizzard scenario or your space alien invasion or your zombie scenario. Having those risk matrices, matrices,
Matrices.
matrices. It's matrices. It is, isn't it? Yeah, having those in place for whatever disaster is more likely to come your way.
And that's really what all of this is about. We take it down to a granular level. We're only
Mhm.
going over a single topic per episode, or on our list episodes, we fine tune it to meet certain criteria. It's not just haphazard. And yeah, we're having a lot of fun talking
We
back
are
and
having
forth
fun.
here.
Yeah, sure.
But this is all super critical information that
Right.
can actually save your life.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny. In this episode, I thought we were going to go over some insurance stuff a little bit, but you're right. Insurance is just such a big topic that we're going to have to spend easily an entire episode on kind of insurance for preppers. So maybe we should do that. I think that's a good one to do. Maybe if we do our Q&A stuff next week, make sure to get your questions in for Chris or I or Joe Flowers, and the best questions get a free Joe Flowers signature Grim Workshop card. But after that episode, maybe we do an insurance, as a prep or insurance for prepper episode. That doesn't sound very exciting, but it actually really, really is, because I think a lot of people just don't read their fucking policy,
As an insurance professional, I will tell you 95+% of people don't actually know what's in their policy. And
Right?
that's because it's boring. It sucks to read
It's
through.
super boring. So we're gonna have to find a way to make insurance exciting, Chris.
I promise it will not be digital Ambien for episode 24. We're not going to
Good.
put you to sleep that
No.
quickly.
I think we can make it exciting. And you know what? It really is your money. So when you think about it, knowing what's in your policy and knowing what to plan for now is like that's how you kind of decide how much money you get when something bad happens. So that should be exciting to everybody.
So, yes, next episode, we're going to do a Q&A. You can
Cool.
ask us any question that you want. You can ask Joe Flowers any question that you want. If you have a question relating to insurance, we'll hit it on episode 24.
Yep, absolutely. We're probably going to have to do a disclaimer for the insurance episode, huh?
I'll make sure that,
Yeah.
we're not giving away any trade secrets and,
This is not
read
advice.
your policy.
We're not giving advice here, but yeah, that kind of wraps it up for me. I know fires is just a giant topic, but when we talked about blizzard preparedness, I think I really did want to talk about fires then, because that's one of the things that is near and dear to me. And we will have to take all of these natural disasters and kind of do a targeted episode or two on each one for sure.
I can't wait for the tsunami episode.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Whenever we do that, whether it's 6 weeks, 6 months, that'll be a fun one.
Dude, when they had the Fukushima, disaster and that tsunami, I went down to the Oregon coast and there was a big giant like dock that had floated over from Japan after that. Then there were a bunch of people down there with like Geiger counters and stuff trying to figure out if it was if it was an issue or not.
That's a little nuts. I don't know if I'd ever do that, but
yeah, it's crazy. But
yeah. Well, I think that about wraps this episode up, AC.
Cool.
What do you think?
Yeah, I think so.
Perfect. Well, we will see you next week for Q&A. Send them in now, stakeholderprepping@gmail.com. You can also get to us on Facebook. But until then, remember, you are your own stakeholder.